was from Operation Moonwatch that the U.S. first began to develop tracking of satellites, orbital paths, durations, time in space, all those kind of things. In the upper left-hand corner, that's the Operation Moonwatch telescope. You could get that at Sears and Roebuck, at Radio Shack. You could buy it assembled or assemble it yourself. It was an international program. There on the upper right, that's the University of Chicago. You can see, of course, the large telescope, but there you see some Operation Moonwatch telescopes. And in the lower part down there, that's actually in Japan. And you can see them looking through Operation Moonwatch telescopes. If you saw a satellite and reported it, you got an Operation Moonwatch badge. Anybody here know anybody or do anything participating in Operation Moonwatch? Yeah, hard to find folks who did that. Well, not only did you have to spot them, but since they were broadcasting, you had to listen. Again, there were no listening stations by the U.S. government at this time. And so they went to ham radio operators and had them listen for broadcasts from satellites. The satellite of that Sputnik beep that you heard was recorded by a ham operator during this time period. This all stayed around until about 1958 when the U.S. started to actually get government observatories and tracking stations online. And it was finally disbanded, Operation Moonwatch, in 1975. They had switched over to tracking satellites and comets and other things in space, and it's finally disbanded in 1975. Well, what was going on in the U.S.? In about 1954, in recognition of the upcoming International Geophysical Year, the U.S. government put out a request for proposal for launch vehicles for satellites. And there were only a couple of folks back then. And the Navy with their Vanguard rocket and the U.S. Army with their Redstone rocket both submitted proposals, and the Vanguard rocket was selected as the launch vehicle for satellites, and the Army was prohibited from developing satellite launch technology. Now, the Army Ballistic Missile Agency in Huntsville, Alabama, was led by Wernher von Braun, who was not a good loser. And he took one of his rockets, Redstone rockets, and put it in a hangar and covered it in tarps. The government went down to inspect to ensure he was not in violation and building satellite technology. And when they found it, they asked him what he was doing, and he said he was testing storage of rockets. And so life went on, and then it came time to counter the Soviets and launch the United States' first satellite on the Vanguard rocket. There you see it. The satellite is that little thing there in the head nose cone. That's the Vanguard rocket. And we have got launch of the United States' first satellite, ignition, and we have liftoff. Liftoff of the United States' first satellite on live television. Interesting though, when you saw it topple, when the satellite hit the ground, it started the broadcast. They thought it was in space. Well, as I said, it was on live television. It was seen around the world, if you will, either on live or later. And it got a lot of comments. The Soviets even said the United Nations might want to send some funding to the United States to assist in the development. Well, the government had no option, and so they turned to Wernher von Braun and said, "What can you do?" He said, "I happen to have a rocket." And he pulled out his rocket, and in January 1958, he launched the U.S. first satellite on what's called the Juno 1. It's actually a modified Redstone rocket. The Redstone rocket was a medium-range intercontinental ballistic missile. And so they didn't want to be launching our civilian satellites on a ballistic atomic rocket, if you will. So they renamed it the Juno 1. And it was launched, and it carried Discoverer 1. There you see William Pickering on the left, James Van Allen in the center, Wernher von Braun on the right. The primary purpose was to find out the radiation belt around the Earth, which was discovered during this. Principal researcher was James Van Allen, And now you know how the Van Allen radiation belt got its name. A big boost to American morale, and of course with President Eisenhower enjoying that. However, while this was going on, a month after Sputnik flew in the Soviet Union, the Soviets launched Laika 2 on Sputnik 2. Laika was a dog. The Soviets used dogs, the Americans used chimps. We'll talk more about that in the future. And Laika was launched and as the largest mammal launch to date. And unfortunately, after her launch, the Soviets had not developed the technology to come down. And she was sent on a one-way flight. They claimed that she lasted for about 7 days and was finally euthanized in the last of her water and food. In actuality, in 2002, they announced that she had actually died several hours after liftoff due to equipment failures, overheating, and stress. But the public outcry for sending Laika on a one-way mission was so great worldwide, even though the great publicity and propaganda value of the launch, that no mammal has been sent into space again without a viable recovery plan. I didn't say successful, I said viable. And so Laika was sent into space. Now the key thing about this was the announcement, if you will, again we'll look at the New York Times, half-ton lift capability. The United States had not launched a satellite yet. This is November, they didn't launch till January the next year. The Soviets were launching a half-ton. What's the significance of that? The significance of that is that's the weight of a Soviet atomic bomb. We'll talk more about that when we look at the Soviets. But the United States, which considered itself invulnerable, major oceans, east and west, friendly countries, north and south, nobody can touch us. We're now within range of the Soviet atomic weapons. Well, just a question for you. What was the nickname given to Laika by the U.S. press in honoring her for her flight? Sputnik. All the Soviet dogs actually were street dogs. They were mutts that were picked up on the street. Well, while not much attention was given by the Eisenhower administration because of Sputnik 1, they weren't very impressed by it, Sputnik 2 got the attention of the U.S. government. First problem we had with the U.S. government was a lot of people thought, how far does national airspace go? Can you overfly a country in space? Or is that still wrong? Well, the Soviets answered that question. They didn't answer anybody. They just launched satellites. So that's a moot point and it exists today. Emphasis on the American space program was put in right away. The National Defense Education Act poured millions of dollars into STEM training, science, technology, math, engineering at all levels of education. The creation of DARPA. DARPA was tasked to maintain an environmental scan of the world, so the U.S. would never be surprised by the technological advance of another country, and also to ensure that the United States was leading in technological advance, and it exists today, and it continues that mission. And finally, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration was created. And we got the NASA meatball. Well, reaction of NASA was very quick in following things, and shortly after, NASA was formed. It approved Project Mercury. Project Mercury had 3 stated objectives. They were orbit a manned spacecraft around the Earth, man's ability to function in space, and return both safely to the planet. There was a 4th unstated objective. What was that? Do it before the Soviets. And that is the emblem of Project Mercury. These did not exist at the time. All the astronauts that flew in Project Mercury just wore their name tag and the NASA emblem. We will not see actual mission patches as you see all the way through the space shuttle and everything until we get into Gemini tomorrow. But they were so popular with Gemini and beyond that they went back and made patches and things for earlier missions. But if anybody tells you that they have a patch from Mercury to sell you, don't buy it. They didn't exist back then. Well, Project Mercury had this flight profile. We're going to concentrate on the bottom two, the 2 Astro chimp flights and 6 manned flights. And also it was to set the stage for the continuing Gemini and Apollo. The first American in space, once Project Mercury got going, was a chimp, number 65, heaviest animal to be launched to date, and also the first train to respond to stimulus. The Soviet dogs, they were just in the container and they just lived, if you will. The Soviet Astro chimps were trained to react to stimulus with lights, to push buttons or pull levers. If they got it right, they got a banana flavored chip that they could eat. If they got it wrong, they got a mild shock to their feet. Right? And so they were responding because just because someone could live in space, they didn't know if they could work in space. Remember, they didn't know at this time, could you swallow in space? Would your eyeballs float out of your head? Could you do any work? So this is the kind of things that they were working on at the time. Well, Ham was named after he was launched and successfully recovered. He wasn't named Ham until after he was recovered. The NASA did not want a dead chimp, named chimp, because of the public reaction so much more to a named as opposed to 65. HAM is actually an acronym. It stands for Holloman Aeromedical Research, Holloman Air Force Base, where the Astro chimps were trained. Now, I say that that is an acronym. We'll see here in a second. 155 miles on an 18-minute suborbital flight and landed 420 miles from the launch site. That's significant. He went further than he was supposed to. And because of that, Wernher von Braun insisted on another test of the rocket. We'll see the implications of that in a moment or two. Well, as I said, HAM was an acronym, but some people felt it was actually a real name for Ham, as he hammed it up. Made the cover of Life magazine a big deal back then. You make the cover of Life, that's like being on the cover, that's like hosting Saturday Night Live now or something like that today. Well, he lived for another 27 years. His final years, he went to a chimp sanctuary, and he's buried at the New Mexico Museum of Space History on the Space Walk of Fame.
Wow.
Officially known as Astro chimps, what was the nickname given to chimpanzees by the U.S. press? They were no more kinder to them than they were to Mutnik. What do you think they were called? Remember? Chimpanzees.
Goodness.
Okay, well, we've talked about the chimps that flew, but we also had the astronauts and we had the Mercury 7. Now, a little more science here. On the left-hand side, there you see the Redstone rocket. The Redstone rocket is only capable of suborbital flight. It doesn't have the oomph to go 17,500 miles an hour into orbit. So, during Project Mercury, when they went to the orbital flights, they switched over to the Atlas rocket on the right, which had the oomph to get up into orbit at 17,500 miles an hour. All right, so that's the two rockets that were used. There's the Mercury 7. From the Air Force, we had Gordon Cooper, Dick Slayton, and Virgil Grissom. From the Navy, we had Al Shepard, Walt Serrar, and Scott Carpenter, and one from the Marine Corps, John Glenn. Now, you saw them in their spacesuits. You also saw them, they always appeared like this, or in a business suit. They were always all-American, but they also looked like this. That's your Mercury 7. And we cannot talk about the Mercury 7 and Project Mercury without mentioning and honoring the women that were behind the astronauts and made a tremendous contribution to the success of Project Mercury throughout, both in their public appearances and with their husbands and maintaining their families and everything else. Well, here's another question for you. The original 7 Mercury astronauts adopted an individual and called him the 8th astronaut. That individual was Bill Dana, Walter Cronkite, or Walter Winchell? Who do you think? We got some contention out there. Walter Cronkite, you think?
Yeah.
Yeah. It was Bill Dana.
All right.
My name, Jose Jimenez. Remember that? Totally politically incorrect. Was on Ed Sullivan all the time, if you will. But he used to do a comedy sketches on being an astronaut, and the astronauts loved him, and they adopted him as the 8th astronaut. Well, the Soviets were first again. April of 1961 with cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin, first human in space to orbit in his capsule Vostok 1. And single orbit, 203 miles high, 103-minute flight. Now what's interesting, remember the Soviets had not figured out how to come down.